That's a good way to do that.
Welcome to those of you who have joined early. We know who is the most excited about this. Just kidding. And welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. And I'm going to invite the tech host to spotlight Matt Carlson, who's going to be our facilitator of the webinar. And if folks are joining and you're not on mute, I invite you to put yourself on mute so that we'll be able to hear panelists. Welcome, welcome. So good to see all these photos and some familiar faces.
So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on reparative justice. My name is Matt Carlson, and I'll be facilitating our conversation tonight. I am a member of the Cultural Change Committee for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, and I'm also the Associate Pastor at Akron Mennonite Church in Akron, PA, which is part of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lenape and Susquehannock tribes. Though we are meeting tonight in a virtual space, we want to begin by acknowledging the indigenous lands that we inhabit. And to this end, I invite you to share your name in the chat, as well as the names of the indigenous nations in whose ancestral lands you live. And if you don't know the lands in which you live, that's okay. I think Katarina is going to put a link in the chat that will help you out. You can click on the link and see where you're living and see which indigenous lands you're inhabiting. So the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a movement of Anabaptists who work together to mobilize the church to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. And some of you may be new to this term, the doctrine of discovery. Our coalition's co-founder, Sarah Augustine, defines the doctrine of discovery as the theological, philosophical, and legal framework dating back to the 15th century that gave Christian governments the moral and legal right to invade and seize indigenous lands and dominate indigenous peoples. It also justified the enslavement of African peoples. Even today, the doctrine of discovery is embedded in our Western legal systems and continues as indigenous peoples are dispossessed from their lands under neocolonialism and threats like pipelines, mining, and other resource extraction. So the coalition seeks to undo what was done in the name of Christ and to pursue justice, right relationship, and reconciliation through an active, nonviolent response. And if you would like to get involved in the work of the coalition, we work at dismantling the doctrine of discovery on 3 levels. And these are places where you can connect if you're interested. Through the Structural Change Committee, which responds to calls from indigenous communities for solidarity and advocacy with decision makers in faith, civic, and political institutions. Through the Cultural Change Committee, which myself and Katarina, and I see Sabrina is also on here, we're part of the Cultural Change Committee. And we design resources to engage communities of faith in education and creative expression. And finally, through the Constituency Engagement Committee, which is the communications and outreach arm of the coalition. And they partner with individuals and institutions in cooperative work. So the Cultural Change Committee is excited to release 2 new resources, a land acknowledgement guide for congregations, and Stories of Repair, a reparative justice resource toward dismantling the doctrine of discovery, which is what we'll be focusing on tonight. And if you were able to see our little promo video that we put out, you have a little taste of what that resource is going to be. So through theological reflections and stories of reparative actions, this resource is meant to inspire Anabaptist communities of faith to take creative action toward repairing the destructive legacy of colonization in their local contexts. We are also grateful to have had the counsel of 3 Indigenous advisors in the creation of this resource: Jim Bear Jacobs, Kelly Sherman Conroy, and Randy Woodley. And this resource will be available tomorrow through our coalition's website, D of D, that's DOFD, Menno, MENNO.org. And I think Katerina is going to put that in the chat. And each participant in tonight's webinar will receive a free PDF of the reparative justice resource, as well as the land acknowledgement guide. And as you may have heard in the beginning, we are recording this webinar and we will make it available to you by email. So that was quite a lengthy introduction. Let's move into our guests that we have tonight, and we are so grateful to have with us tonight Erica Littlewolf, Elaine Enns, and Ched Myers, and John Stoesz, each of whom has contributed to the reparative justice resource. Erica Littlewolf met via Zoom with Sue Park Herr, who is the denominational minister for transformative peacemaking for MCUSA, to have a conversation in the months following the police shooting of George Floyd, which many of us remembered yesterday, marking its 1-year anniversary. Their dialogue about how the murder of George Floyd sparked activism and conversations about race, white supremacy, and the American dream of immigrants is found in the theological reflection portion of this new resource. Ched Myers and Elaine Enns share a theological reflection of the story of the rich man and Jesus found in Mark's gospel, drawing connections between discipleship and reparations. This reflection is adapted from a chapter of their new book, Healing Haunted Histories. And in the Stories of Reparative Justice section of the resource, John Stoesz shares his personal story and how he was led to return a portion of his family farmland inheritance and ultimately work with Makoche Ikichupi, the Dakota Land Recovery Program. So welcome to each of you, and thank you for taking time to share with us this evening. So I just gave a brief introduction of how each of these contributed to our resource, and I would like to turn it now to them and ask each of you to take about a minute to introduce yourselves. And Erica, if we could start with you, just tell us more about yourself, on whose lands you live, who you represent, what you are currently working on, and anything else that you have to share with us. So thank you, Erica.
Awesome, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Mic check, check, check. Okay. Wotam Pivadayev Wonhat Nahishavenatistas. My name is Erica Littlewolf. I am Northern Cheyenne, currently living on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation on a small portion of my original homelands. My original homelands would have been up into what is now present day Canada, over into Minnesota, all the way down into Kansas, all the way over into Colorado, and back up into Montana, where I am now. I currently work with Mennonite Central Committee Central States. with the Indigenous Visioning Center, where I work on social justice issues with Indigenous people, and specifically with the Doctrine of Discovery. I would also like to acknowledge, as was mentioned before, the very, very, very intertwined stories of stolen land and stolen bodies and stolen labor, as I don't think these can be worked apart, and so they must be solved together. So just acknowledging that along with the stolen land here on what we often refer to as Turtle Island, we also have the transatlantic slave trade that came after stolen land, of the removal of indigenous African people from the continent of Africa who were enslaved in order to build up what we now call America. And that makes the whole picture of the Doctrine of Discovery: stolen land, stolen people, stolen labor, and just acknowledging that those are the whole picture. And what I'm currently working on is unpacking that, still looking at the whole picture and seeing what has manifested, continues to manifest in present day as a result of a country being built on that, and also beginning to look at the role of Christian Zionism in all of that. And that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Erica. John, would you be willing to share? And the questions that I had there are: where do you live? Whose lands do you live on? Who do you represent? What are you currently working on? And then anything else that you would like to share with the group.
Mhm. Thank you, Matt. I am John Stoesz. I am currently living in Mountain Lake, Minnesota, which is my hometown. And it is Dakota homeland. I became involved, particularly in this work around Indigenous justice and dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, when I was at MCC Central States and with Erica, and was a part of the Indigenous Visioning Circle. That kind of gave me my start in this. So, so thank you, Erica. Appreciate that very much. I am currently working on, well, raising awareness, fundraising, and organizing among white Minnesotans for Dakota land recovery. That's enough for me.
Thank you, John. And then Elaine and Ched. And I'll leave it up to you two how you want to handle. My guess is you'll play off each other a little bit. But just to repeat those questions: where do you live? Whose lands do you live on? Who do you represent? What are you currently working on? And then anything else that you would like to share with us.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Haku, we are beaming to you from traditional unceded Chumash territory in the Ventura River watershed here in Southern California, where we live and work. Elaine and I are a binational Mennonite couple with roots in Saskatchewan and California, respectively. Through Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, a small ecumenical nonprofit, we pursue education, organizing, and advocacy at the intersection of faith, justice, and radical discipleship. Our first joint publication was a 2009 two-volume Ambassadors of Reconciliation project, in which we explored restorative justice through New Testament texts and contemporary practitioners.
And then for the last decade, I've been working on what restorative justice means for historical harms. And this resulted in our book, which Matt already mentioned, Healing Haunted Histories, a Settler Discipleship of Decolonization. And it was published 3 months ago. And we are currently working intensively from that project through online study groups, interviews, and programs like this. And we're enjoying that very much. Our annual Bartimaeus Institute, which works at the intersection of seminary, sanctuary, street, and soil, has been focusing since 2012 on watershed discipleship and Indigenous settler justice issues. So we are very pleased to be a part of this circle today. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Chad and Elaine, and thank all of you for sharing that introduction. We'll move now into our first question, and we'll go back to Erica, start with you, Erica. And after each of you answers, I'll give each of you a chance to answer the question. I'll repeat the question as needed. And then at the end, you'll have a chance to respond to each other. If you hear something that one of the other presenters says that piques your interest or connects maybe with something that you're doing, we'll allow some space at the end for you to respond to that. And the question is, can you share a story that illustrates what it means to repair harms done to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands under the Doctrine of Discovery? And this could be related to the piece that you included in the reparative justice resource, or it could be another experience. And Erica, before you speak, I just want to give a shout out to Sue Park Her. I see she's on the call. So welcome, Sue Park Her. So Erica, I'll turn it over to you.
Yay, Sue. Yes, Sue is my conversation partner for this piece that we did for this new resource. I could not have done it without her, that is for sure. Well, technically, I probably could have just talked to myself like I do every day now that I'm quarantining by myself, right? You know, yeah, so I think I like to start small, I think. And so I think it comes down to the little things that we do every single day, and sometimes the little things that we don't do every single day. And so for me, what Sue and I ended up talking about was this process of acknowledgement. And so in Indigenous communities, when someone speaks, sometimes it takes maybe, especially if they're an elder, it can take like maybe a half an hour for them just to introduce themselves, because they're acknowledging everyone, they're acknowledging their relatives. And if you've ever heard the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, they are acknowledging all the beings, not even just human beings, but like the plant beings, the animal beings, everything. And with that acknowledgement brings thanks. There's a, if the word thanks isn't in there, it is, it's embedded in the acknowledgement. And so for Indigenous communities, what it means to not acknowledge, on the opposite side of non-acknowledgement, is actually to be angry with each other. And so if you're at a social gathering and you see someone maybe make a little bit of eye contact and walk by each other and not shake each other's hand, you're like, ooh, they got beef. And if you're not in an Indigenous community, you probably didn't even think anything happened. But if you are from the community, you're like, oh, it's beef, and it's good beef, because they just did it in public. And so that is actually seen as really aggressive. And the longer they don't acknowledge you at the same event, then it just keeps getting worse, worse, worse. And so that's something that can be done every single day. And that's land acknowledgements. And when I think about land acknowledgements, we did in MCC Central States, everyone picked a tribe and worked at understanding that tribe and how would we acknowledge that tribe. And I think that's a perfect place for every place to start. And I think the other thing, if you really look at land acknowledgement, it is hugely profound, because the very basis of the Doctrine of Discovery is the idea of terra nullius, this empty land. And this idea of empty land and this idea of because these indigenous people weren't Christian, they weren't people. And so the land is empty. And so by doing an land acknowledgement, you're humanizing what was dehumanized. And so if you take your land acknowledgement seriously, you're undoing like 500 years of dehumanizing history. And what you're saying is, I don't agree with that. I am saying that when people came here, there were people here, and these were their names. These are their tribal names. This is the land that they lived on, and they were human just as much today as they were the day that someone discovered this land, right? You can't discover land people were already on. And so I think when you take it to that level, then it's radical. Then it's just not something that I'm going to read off of a piece of paper. No, this is radical, because in this age, we're still dehumanizing indigenous people. We're still dehumanizing Black people. We're still dehumanizing all people of color. And so to give a human aspect, to recognize the tribal identity and not the monolith that all tribal people are the same. And so I think that acknowledgement, as simple as it sounds, it can be very complex. And especially if you're a Native and you tend to be the only Native in a space, if you hear a gathering start with an acknowledgement of the land, then you're like, whoo, okay, maybe I can work with these people. Like, at least like this is going on. Like maybe I'll stay in the room a little bit longer, unless they don't have meat at lunch, and then you're ready to head out and go get a burger at Burger King. But so yeah, so I think that would be what I would have to share is the value. You cannot value acknowledgement enough. And I think even you know how much it's comforting. It can bring comfort to people too as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And I failed to mention, as you're listening to Erica and John and Ched and Elaine, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Katarina Friesen will be monitoring that, and we'll gather those questions for the end. So John, let's move on to you. So the question again, can you share a story that illustrates what it means to repair harms done to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands under the Doctrine of Discovery? And again, this can be related to your piece or can encompass broader experiences that you've had.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Erica. You said part of what I was going to say about, you know, a major root cause of systemic racism in our world is the Doctrine of Discovery. Stolen land, stolen bodies, stolen labor is rooted in the Doctrine of Discovery. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to focus on land reparations. The Doctrine of Discovery first came to my mind at Mennonite Central Committee Central States and the Indigenous Visioning Circle. And I remember Harley Eagle was the first one I heard talking about the Doctrine of Discovery. And when I learned about the Doctrine of Discovery, I said to myself, the land was really stolen. Then in 2012, I was still at MCC at that point. My family decided to sell my grandparents' farm in southwestern Minnesota. And this is where, for me, the rubber hit the road. And through conversations with the Indigenous Visioning Circle, and reflecting on the biblical story of Zacchaeus, who benefited as a rich tax collector, benefited from an oppressive system, the tax collection system, he decided in order to follow Jesus, he had to make a big change. So he returned half his wealth to the oppressed, to those oppressed by that tax collection system. and 4 times as much to anyone he personally defrauded. So I decided to take, my inheritance, which was after tax $120,000, and take half of that, $60,000, and distribute it to Indigenous communities working for land justice, most to Makoche Ikikchupi, or Dakota Land Recovery, because that's where my grandparents' farm was located, on Dakota homeland. And I met with a couple of the governing council members of Makoche Ikikchupi. They actually came to Mountain Lake. And I had decided to do I ride a recumbent tricycle. So a long trike ride to raise awareness in Minnesota, 2,000-mile trike ride through 40 county seats, and try to get a newspaper story with a picture in each of those. And I got 29 of those. So there was some awareness raising there. And when we started, these 2 governing council members came to Mountain Lake, and they met with me and my mom at the lake, and they actually did in Dakota a commissioning service. And they commissioned me to raise awareness and to raise money for Dakota Land Recovery. And one of the things I learned from these Dakota people is, it is not the responsibility of Dakota people to donate their own money to buy back stolen land. And it is not their responsibility to raise the money for that. It is we who are white settlers who have that responsibility. Of course, being accountable to the Indigenous community or communities that we are under the leadership of. So I think that's my story, So I am continuing that work. I'm retired, so I have time to do presentations and raise money for Makoche Ikikchupi. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So Elaine and Ched, your turn. So can you share a story that illustrates what it means to repair harms done to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands under the Doctrine of Discovery, related to your piece or broader?
The Dismantling Doctrine of Discovery Coalition really takes a radical approach to address contemporary injustice, which is to say, it seeks to exhume the historical roots of oppression by looking at how 15th and 16th century European church doctrines asserted political, legal, and theological rationalization for the project of colonization, a project that has left no corner of Turtle Island untouched over the last half millennium. Our work similarly tries to seek the roots of our personal, collective, and communal histories of entanglement in this colonial project, inviting settlers to probe deeply into what we call our landlines, bloodlines, and songlines. Our immigrant ancestors, bloodlines, were often complicit in the dispossession and displacement of Indigenous communities. And so are we every time we resettle across the North American landscape, landlines. Our scriptures, songlines, challenge us to learn and deepen personal and political practices of becoming more faithful covenant people by honoring treaties and inhabiting our watersheds more justly. So our piece in the coalition resource explores the infamous gospel story of Jesus' call of the rich man in Mark 10, related to John's story of Zacchaeus in Luke. This story makes it clear that discipleship for those of us who have benefited from land theft and fraud entails redistributive justice. Hashtag reparation, hashtag land back. That is how we heal, and that is how we help in the wider repair work of decolonization. It's a fact that our settler discourses of reconciliation too often presume to resolve centuries of oppression with ritual apologies and immediate forgiveness. But the semantics and politics of reconciliation are increasingly rejected by both Indigenous and Black activists because settler colonialism requires systemic transformation, not rhetorical contrition. The Apostle Paul reminds us Christians that grace is not cheap in 2 Corinthians 5. His phrase, ministry of reconciliation, uses a Greek term that connotes an exchange of money to establish equity. We still speak of reconciling a bank statement, for example. That's why Jesus in Mark 10 stipulates that redistributive justice is the only way to realize the kingdom of God, which is a hard but necessary word to settlers who have inherited advantages and lands based on conquest and colonization.
So our work seeks to challenge and encourage and equip settlers to do the demanding inward and outward work of understanding how deeply deformed and implicated we are by the history and legacy of colonization. Much of our new book project focuses on the story of my Prairie Mennonite community over the last 100 years in Saskatchewan, and then my resettlements in California. And woven throughout is the struggle around Washtenaw-Chikatanaw, and that's 45 minutes north of where I grew up. In the 17th century, this area was part of a land grant given to Hudson's Bay Company by the English king, called Rupert's Land. Legitimated by the Doctrine of Discovery's principle of contiguity, it included all of the land drained by watercourses into the Hudson's Bay, a stunningly vast area consisting of nearly a third of present-day Canada. Mennonites were among the first settlers to arrive in Saskatchewan in the early 1890s. When they petitioned the Canadian Crown for more land, the government took land reserved for the young Chippewayan band under the 1876 Treaty 6, and without consultation or compensation, gave it to these Mennonites. In 1976, at a centenary celebration of Treaty 6, Cree elders protested. 100 years of broken promises was the litany they recited. While some young Chippewayan activists visited Mennonite farmsteads, reminding Mennonites that they were on Indigenous land. So this gerfuffle animated both defensive reactions and constructive responses in my community. And today, MCC Saskatchewan, some of the local farmers and members of a Lutheran church that once sat atop Washtenaw-Chikatanaw continue to work in partnership with young Chippewayan efforts to both gain federal recognition and regain land. We tell this story at length in the book as an example of the long and halting but crucial journey of settler reparation. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing. So as we were listening to these stories, and I'll direct this to Erica, John, Elaine, and Ched, what themes came out for you as you were listening to each other? Were there points that you could connect with, that you would like to respond to? I know, John, you responded a bit to Erica regarding racism, the roots of racism in the United States. Any other pieces that you latched onto as you were listening to each other?
Oh, well, I was just gonna, Erica, I really appreciated your words about land acknowledgement being the opposite of terra nullius, and that when we participate in them, we are, of course, naming the people that were here, but humanizing what and we know land acknowledgements are so important, but thank you for nuancing that for me a little bit and bringing it more, yeah, well, just putting it in, putting those different pieces around it. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think acknowledging that the acknowledgement is part of the process of unerasing
Yes.
a system of erasure helps keep land acknowledgements politicized so that they don't become a kind of a new pro forma thing that people have to do. So I also really appreciated that. Thank you.
Chad, I appreciated your reflections on Mark and tying it to Zacchaeus. I think one of the things that we have to do, those of us who are Christian and have a biblical tradition, is we have to reinterpret the stories. If we fail to do so, these stories will continue to reinforce the doctrine of discovery and stolen land and stolen people and stolen labor as they have for centuries of Christian experience. This often is done in subtle ways. And so we need to be, as you are doing, Elaine and Chad, we need to be retelling those stories to bring out the justice aspects that have been hidden for too long.
Yeah, and we forget that before our tradition became so entangled in colonization, our tradition was itself colonized. And so this process of rereading our tradition is to try to decolonize our songlines so that they can, again, animate decolonization solidarity work. And I do think that that's a big part of our work.
We are just a couple minutes ahead of our schedule. So I don't know, Katerina, maybe if there are some questions from the audience related to what was just shared, that might be appropriate at this time.
I'm wondering about Michelle Armster's question. How should we respond to people who say, well, I didn't steal the land, I didn't own any slaves, why should I have to pay? Seems like connects to some of the points that you all have been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I will take a stab at that one because, as I've gone around and spoken in churches and colleges and conferences, this question has come up more than once. And I make a distinction between, being the first to steal the land and continuing to benefit from stolen land. And so in my case, I continue to benefit from stolen land. And when I inherited a portion of my grandparents' farm, which was, land that was previous to my grandparents, stolen from the Dakota people, I was continuing the legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. I was continuing the legacy of Manifest Destiny. I was continuing the theft of land by inheriting that land. So I don't think that I am innocent of that. I don't, even though I was unaware for most of my life that this was the case, I think we need to rethink what land theft means And it's not something that happened 200 years ago or 300 years ago or 100 years ago. It's something that continues. And we are a part of that continuance. Okay, so that's most of what I have to say in response to that question.
You know, how I would respond to that, Unangunk scholar, Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang talk about settler moves to innocence. And we used their framework and identified about 10 of them in our book. And this is a classic one. It's named personal dissociation. And it's this personal detachment from history, which is a uniquely North American conceit of settler colonialism. The ahistoric individual understands themselves as a free-floating entity, neither constrained nor advantaged by the past. So the settler I is unaccountable to a history which is not my fault, disinterested in how I continue to benefit from historic arrangements in the present, and concerned chiefly with my personal future. So it is one of the moves that we hear very often. The way you phrased it, Michelle, is what we are up against all the time. And so naming it as it is a concrete settler move to shed our responsibility of colonization.
And I think as a person of color who is Indigenous, I think it's always interesting to always be aware of our context when we travel to other countries. Like, what are we doing in other countries? You know, that perspective, because I always see these commercials about, come to Belize, there's free land. That sounds shady by this day and age, you know? And so I think being aware of that, and then also being aware of within our communities, how we perpetuate anti-Blackness, and how that has manifested. And there were many tribes on the, wait, I'm getting my directions, East Coast, who did practice enslavement of people. And so I think understanding that complexity and really having the willingness to uncover that this is a system. This is a system that benefits white supremacy, and that this is meeting a goal that does not benefit people of color. So even if it looks like people of color are at ends with each other, it's like we're not benefiting by any means whatsoever. It's still benefiting a white supremacist system. And so the willingness to look at history and look at those as people of color and those painful parts where we may have been pit against each other, but always remember that there is a system that in some way or another demands that of us. And our willingness to look at it and name it and sit in discomfort and get stomach aches and move on from it. Because it was made to divide us. I mean, you can see, I read this book, Hillbilly Elegy, and how poor white folks were made to believe that they could aspire to wealth. And that's why they started siding with white people instead of poor people of color. And so there you have another divide, right? But they never gain wealth. Year after year after year after year, they never gain wealth. But there's this opportunity, and that's still this illusion, right, of this white supremacist system. It's like this, it's like a drug, right? Like this mirage somewhere that I don't know who gets there. I mean, 3%, I don't know who gets there. I don't want to get there. But yeah, so as a person of color, I think the willingness to look at that and why, and I think always locating ourselves within different contexts and different places.
Answers, and thank you for those who have submitted questions. Keep those coming. We'll have a time at the end as well to answer questions. And then the next question that we have for our presenters, and Erica, if it's okay to start with you again. So what is your call to the church when it comes to dismantling the doctrine of discovery and the work of repair?
First of all, am I calling the church on a cell phone? Just kidding. So, this is a really good question. And okay, so there's a couple things I thought of. And I've really been thinking about this in regard especially to restorative justice work. And I think restorative justice work always assumes that there was a relationship to begin with. And so I think when I read this, sometimes it's difficult to think about the church repairing a relationship with Indigenous people when there was never a relationship to begin with. The church interacted with Indigenous people very patriarchally. I mean, they were just an extension of the government, putting us in boarding schools, making sure we stayed on the reservation. They served as extensions of policing, essentially, and pretty much are the people in this day and age still saying, like, you can either be Christian or you can be Native, giving that rhetoric. And so if that's the kind of relationship there is, I'm not sure how you repair that, because at this point in time, the church still wants Indians to not be Indian. I think it's like, you can come to church, but don't do your traditional ways either, because we're not really going to outright say it, but that's the devil, So I don't know how they repaired that relationship. It might just be better to let the old thing die and maybe try having a relationship to begin with. Like, let's have a divorce and then maybe try having a relationship. And then I think about the one things I think about, about reparations, and I've seen it so many times, is what gets in the way is what I would call white supremacy culture, these ways of being that are so ingrained in our culture that we don't even know that we do it. And some of these are like white supremacy culture, like perfectionism, or being urgent, time urgent, or just being plain urgent, or like all the either or thinking, all these things that happen as a result of whiteness, that are valued, that are in our institutions, that we do every single day. And the one thing that I've noticed is that, and it's absolutely goofy to me, is that when I have witnessed, particularly white folks, give things to Native communities, there are always these sneaky little strings attached. As many probing questions as I ask, and as direct as I am, and I'm looking around making sure there's no strings attached, there still is, because then they want a news article or they want a picture next to it so they can put it in the church bulletin, or they want this. And that is just batshit crazy to me, because in Native culture, you give no strings attached. And so if I frame it up like, okay, you're going to give back stolen land, and then you want your back patted for it and accolades for giving back stolen land. That is about as goofy gets. Like, what? Like, even a little kid steals a little kid's toy, and then the kid gives the toy back, and now you're gonna celebrate that he stole something but gave something stolen back, and so now he's a hero? Like, and I think what it does is it takes back, it's like either way in the story, it's like somehow white folks always win, you know? And so I think there needs to be, what I would say to the church is the thinking has to change too. Because the church has gotten so used to tapping itself on the back, clapping its hands for giving money to these poor people everywhere. And woo, we feel good about ourselves and all this kind of stuff. But can we practice giving with no strings attached? Like sometimes, you know, people buy a goat for Africa. They literally want a picture of their goat in Africa. Like, girl, I'm gonna run outside right now and take a picture of my goat and send it to, you know, like, who tracks their gifts? I mean, that is beyond my worldview. And so I think the mindset needs to change too, not just with the reparations. It's like the spirit in which you give, the energy in which you give. Because to me, sometimes I'm like, ooh, I don't want that. Like, because if you give us a space of land and we decide to set up a powwow ground, I don't want all these church cars cruising by, be pointing at it while we're having ceremony, being like, I gave that back. You know, like, don't no one want that. And so I think I think a lot about the church needing to change and look at and how subcultural competency, you know, and the power structures and all those different ways of being that for Native people, we see it really different, and that perhaps in this process of giving back or repair, that maybe it is better done in the way that Natives do it, instead of the way that the church has always done it. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you, Erica. John, what is your call to the church?
Well, I recall a book written by Jennifer Harvey, and the title was Dear White Christians, for Those Still Longing for Racial Reconciliation. And in that book, Dr. Harvey says that if you want reconciliation, then make reparations for stolen land and stolen labor. So that's part of my call. But I certainly hear what Erica says about no strings. You know, one of the things that I learned from Dakota Land Recovery from Makocha Ikikchupi is Dakota people who are involved in that know much better than I do what the money should be used for. So, you know, they quite explicitly asked me to, you know, help raise money for them. But when people ask me, where is that money going to go? I say that is their decision. You know, we are returning stolen property. We have no business to ask, Now, what are you going to do with what I stole from you? As Erica said, that's goofy, you know. So I am very interested in the work of the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition in thinking about a network of repair congregations and repair communities. How is that going to go forward? I think this is the right direction for the church, but Erica has put out some things there for saying, okay, but you better be careful on how you do this. If we see strings attached, then you are not doing it in the right spirit. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you, John. Chad and Elaine, what is your call to the church when it comes to dismantling the doctrine of discovery and the work of repair?
I think our call to the church is the same as the call to ourselves. We are trying to invite and accompany settler Christians to go deeper into a discipleship of decolonization and to empower settlers in the practices of restorative solidarity. And by this, we mean it's a journey consisting of 4 interrelated commitments. And so the first one is to revisioning our settler identity. And this means doing our own work around issues like agnosia, which is the culture of knowing. We don't know about the past, we don't want to know about the past, and we don't care that we don't know about the past. And dissociation, which we talked about earlier. It's about white fragility, ethnic loss, assimilation, impact of moral injury, complicity. Erica, what you were talking about, the white folks always winning. One of the things that struck me in working with our communal narratives as a Mennonite community were the stories of our heroism and our the mythology about how we had come to the prairies and made it better, and that words of us always coming out on top is a part of what we have to revision about our settler identity. And we're doing this work to understand and heal our own deformation by the legacy and structures of settler colonialism. So that's one. Secondly, to relationship building with Indigenous communities and especially our neighbors. And this includes, it must include listening to how these and other marginalized communities have been victimized by historic and current injustices, and how these folks are identifying harms, needs, and responsibilities, and investigating our complicity and entanglement in historic and current systems of oppression. And third, we need to engage in restorative actions that support work for Indigenous justice. So how can we best support and join local Native leaders in their work of education, advocacy, organizing, protest, and reconstruction? And then fourth is to reparative experiments. This entails working with Indigenous communities to make things as right as possible. That's a restorative justice phrase, including covenants of accountability, restitution, reparations, repatriation, and after all of that, perhaps over time, we can get to reconciliation together.
And I think it's important always to stress that this is a life work. This isn't just an issue box to check. It's not just a check to write. It is a journey of discipleship. And all the things, all the commitments that Elaine just narrated represent a process, an ongoing circle. After each initiative, we pause, we see what we have to learn, What we have learned, we discern next steps to deepen our practices. Repeat. It's for the rest of our lives. Our tradition calls this repentance. Michelle Armster was talking about this in the chat. Repentance simply means the struggle to turn our personal and political lives around and head in a different direction. So we understand the work of deconstructing our own settler entitlement in terms of Jesus' strange parable about exorcism in Luke 11, in which our possession and occupation by unclean spirits goes 7 layers deep. It's a profound journey of transformation inwardly and outwardly. We also like to liken it to recovering from a profound collective addiction, a journey that requires time, attention, resources, support, and accountability. So we want to help turn our churches into spaces where such transformations can be nurtured. We've learned a great deal from the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation process and from how that commission's calls to action are shaping the future vocation of many church colleagues up there. All of this in turn then can animate a transformed mission of the church as restorative solidarity. 6 times in the New Testament, the Psalmic promise is repeated: the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. We think in our time that this means giving priority to the very indigenous peoples and cultures that our ancestors rejected. Similarly, the book of Colossians exhorts, do not lie to one another. Colossians 3:9. The mendacities of the doctrines of discovery in both their medieval and contemporary versions lie at the root of a long history of settler apostasy. It is our conviction that only a discipleship of decolonization can lead us toward healing, renewal, and justice. So that is our call to ourselves and our church.
Thank you, Elaine and Ched, John and Erica, for your engagement with these questions. And again, we're grateful for you taking time tonight to be with us and to share from your experience, to share from your work. Before we move into our question and answer time, I just want to open it up for any of you to have any closing remarks, any final reflections, responses to each other, or calls to action.
I would like to just take a minute to recall something Erica will remember, which is the mantra of the Indigenous Visioning Circle, which is to identify and resource Indigenous strength and genius while staying on the path of decolonization and relationship. Couple of things about that. We don't focus on the needs of Indigenous folks. We focus on the strength and genius of Indigenous folks. We focus on staying on this path. We focus on decolonization of the whole system, including ourselves as white people. And everything is built on relationship. I think that is such a powerful way of trying to, say what this work is about. So I didn't come up with this. This was created by the Indigenous Visioning Circle.
I think I would just like to acknowledge and a reminder that right now many Indigenous communities are in mourning, as we have been hit and impacted hugely by by the COVID-19, and have experienced a lot of death. And we don't grieve like dominant society. In my community, we grieve an entire year. And so that would be until next summer. And I just talked with one of my friends from the Philippines who they were able to keep COVID out of their community until this February. And so just now did COVID hit their community and is wreaking havoc in this Indigenous community in the Philippines. And so when I was on the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, was all by Zoom this year, hearing the reporting from all over globally about how impacted Indigenous people have been is horrible. And so I guess just thinking of that in your requests and asks and summer plans, that people are grieving, and that if you don't hear back from people, like that's probably why. And it's may not be a good time to ask a lot of Indigenous folks right now.
Thank you for those words, John and Erica. We'll move now into our question and answer time. And Katerina, how are we doing on time? I know we had slotted 15 minutes for Q&A. Can we do the full 15 if we go that long? Can folks, 10 minutes? All right, 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to say this one slowly because it's a lot to it. This one comes from Summer Star, and her question is, well, she begins with a statement. There is a big movement among many Christians to revive earth connection practices. Can you talk about how this becomes whitewashed when there isn't a recognition of the harms done to earth honoring cultures through things like the Doctrine of Discovery, and even the demonization of these cultures by the church? And then related to that, how do you see earth connection, interspiritual work, and reparations going hand in hand? And if you want me, if you can, you might be able to see it there in your chat if you want to connect with that one. Or if you need me to repeat it, I'm happy to repeat it.
No, I really appreciate, Summer, you centering this. It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue in environmental movements and creation care movements in our churches. So much attention to the ecology of a place without equal attention to the peopled history of these places, and not just the peopled history and present, but the way in which the land itself holds stories of survivance, stories of oppression, stories of resistance. And so we find ourselves, because we're engaged in many of these communities, really pushing folks to pay attention to that apprenticeship to a place, which is a really important thing particularly for white folk and white Christians to get. But if that apprenticeship doesn't include apprenticing ourselves to the first peoples of a place, to the indigenous peoples currently in a place, then we actually are missing the character of that place. So I appreciate you raising that, and I think we need to be really consistent in insisting with our environmental and eco-justice friends that this intersection can't be pulled apart and should not.
I would just like to say that as Dakota Land Recovery works at, recovering land and Dakota culture on that land, also what repair means is healing the lands and the waters themselves. This is so central to Indigenous visions and Dakota visions of what repair means. It is not simply returning property. It is also returning the environment to a pristine condition that it was in before white invasion and settlement. What white people did to this land in only a couple of hundred years is so destructive. And I don't think we can rely on white people to fix it. Okay.
I think, I guess there's just a couple things that come to mind. One is what tends to happen, I think, when dominant culture goes earth-based is they tend to go overboard and then culturally appropriate. So I think, and that just comes because of the privilege and power of dominant culture and the ability to do that. And so I would red flag, be aware of the cultural appropriation. And I think also dominant society, I think wants to be comfortable and be nice. And that means we want to be earth-based and maybe promote recycling because it's not that political, but because maybe they're not affected by dirty water, because Indigenous folks, we're like on the front line. We're going to be well, we probably already are drinking that dirty water. So for us to be earth-based like we already are is very political. So we can't detach. And for us to access our historical sites, like Mount Graham and Bear Butte is a political act. And so I think the willingness, if you're going to go earth-based, the willingness to engage politically with Indigenous people's struggle to access their sites. So it would be those justice issues that are seen as political versus like, oh yeah, we'll set up a recycling bin after church. So I think that willingness, that's where you're going to need to go with it, is the two things I think of.
Thank you all for your engagement with that question, and thank you, Summer, for posting that. We've got about 4 minutes. One more question, and this comes from Felix Almeida, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And Felix writes, the Doctrine of Discovery traces its origins to a papal edict whereby the Pope gave the entire non-white world to Europeans for subjugation, conversion, and exploitation for Europe's benefit. Would a petition to the Pope asking for pronounced apology not be a vital starting point?
Actually, I think what happened was there was a line made, and I think wasn't it Spain and Portugal split the world, and this was so not the entire world. This sounds crazy. I can't believe we're having this conversation. So not the entire world, just part of the world. So this was the part that Spain got, and wherever they speak Portuguese is the part that Portugal got. And there have been Indigenous people that have hit the Pope up. Yeah, the demarcation line. Yeah. And so there have been nuns that have been very active in dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. And I think the take that I have gotten from the Pope is that he has just pretty much said, like, oh, it's not relevant anymore, like kind of thing. So it wouldn't really matter if it was taken back kind of thing. So I don't know how much it would matter because it's been implemented into US law, and then Canada took it, and now it's global law in relation to Indigenous people and land. And so once it got into the law system, you would need to have, and has been used as late as 2005 by homegirl Ruth. And so you would need probably a case in the US that would break precedents, and then another case to break precedents, and then maybe a case in another part of the globe to break that precedence that could probably do away with that. But I don't know how much impact it would have, the Pope would have.
Yeah, and as Erica, you're saying, there have been a number of attempts to petition the Pope, to lobby the Pope, to educate the Pope, and not just this Pope, but several preceding popes. So folks are working on it in Catholic Peace and Justice and Indigenous Catholics. Our friend Harry LaFond, Cree elder up in Saskatchewan, has had an audience with the Pope back in the 1990s trying to raise these issues. So folks are working on this. But Erica's point, what is going to be the most effective in contemporary terms? It may be just as effective to get people to, in addition to renouncing doctrines of discovery, to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in all fashions, which is one of the points that the Canadian TRC is really pressing upon institutions, including churches, essentially replacing these old doctrines with this more contemporary UN document crafted by Indigenous people.
We are at the, oh, sorry, John, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, hear, hear. We find the roots of injustice in the Doctrine of Discovery. We find the seeds of healing in the United Nations document on the rights of Indigenous people. So if you are not familiar with that document, it is really a very important document. Thank you.
And thank you all again. We're at the end of our time. This has been a rich conversation. Thank you again, Ched, Elaine, John, and Erica, for being here with us tonight. Again, to share from your work, your experience, the years of engaging with these issues. We really appreciate your time tonight. Katerina, are there any logistical things we need to consider before we say goodnight?
I just want to invite whoever would like to get involved in the coalition or learn more to reach out. I put my email address as a coalition organizer in the chat. And if you're interested in joining one of our working groups, we have an annual meeting coming up by Zoom, August 13th through 15th, where we're going to be sharing more about how to engage in the coalition. So check out the links. We'll send the recording, as well as if you'd like the chat or didn't get all the links saved from it, we can send out the links in the chat as well, and the free resources that these amazing folks have contributed to. So thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here, and have a good night.
Wow, those numbers just go down really fast.
I think I counted 116 people or so, 120.
119, Kat, 119.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I had 5 screens with 24 screens on, 24 screens on each.
Oh,
5
wonderful.
pages. Yeah.
Well, we can stop recording, and if you want to hang out for a few minutes as panelists